Brandon did not whisper when he said, "You will be dead when we get home." He did not even bother to be discreet. His voice cut sharply through the pristine white tablecloth and the flickering candlelight, loud enough that the older couple seated 2 tables away lifted their eyes from their salmon. The fork in Emily's hand froze midair. The Italian pasta she had curled carefully, 1 strand at a time, because heaven forbid she ate it the wrong way and gave him another excuse to criticize her, now looked like evidence laid out at a crime scene. Evidence of what? She did not know. Ordering the wrong dish? Chewing too loudly? Or simply existing? "I only asked you one simple question," Brandon continued, his jaw clenched tight. "Were you flirting with the waiter?" "No." Her voice was smaller than she intended. "I just said thank you, that's all." "You smiled at him." "I was being polite." "You are not allowed to smile at other men." His hand reached across the table, clamping around her wrist, not hard enough to bruise, never hard enough for anyone else to notice, but tight enough to make the bones ache. "Do you understand me?" It always happened this way. A romantic dinner, something Brandon had planned, always his idea, always starting pleasantly. He would tell her what she should order, of course because he knew what suited someone with her figure. He would comment on her makeup, pointing out that she should have chosen a plum lipstick instead of the pale pink that made her face look washed out, and then, inevitably, something would ignite his temper. Some imagined slight, some invented disrespect, and she would pay for it later, in the car, at home, in 1,000 small ways that left no trace anyone else could see. "I understand," Emily whispered. "Good." He released her and lifted his glass of wine. "Because when we get home, you and I are going to have a long talk about respect." The words hung between them like smoke. Emily's stomach twisted. She knew exactly what those talks looked like. They began with him blocking the bedroom doorway. Then came the wall at her back, his voice rising, his face so close she could feel his breath, his presence squeezing the air out of the room. They ended with her apologizing for things she had not done, promising to be better, then crying silently into her pillow while he slept peacefully beside her as if nothing had happened. 3 years. 3 years of this, and she still had not found the courage to leave. She looked down at the engagement ring on her finger, a small diamond Brandon had chosen without asking her opinion. The ring felt as heavy as shackles. "Eat," Brandon said. "You are drawing attention." She was drawing attention. Of course she was. It was always her fault. Emily tried to lift the fork again, but her hand trembled. The pasta blurred through the tears she fought to keep from falling. Not here. Not in public. That would only make everything worse. She did not notice the man at the next table. Not at first. He sat alone. Unusual for a Friday night at Morello's, the most expensive Italian restaurant in the River North district of Chicago. Most patrons came in couples or groups, dressed up to celebrate anniversaries or finalize business deals. But that man seemed to belong to another world entirely. His charcoal gray suit fit with immaculate precision, his dark hair neatly combed, silver threading his temples. His face looked as if it had been lifted from an old cinematic poster, a sharp jawline, high cheekbones, eyes shadowed and deep in the dim light. And those eyes were fixed on Brandon, not with curiosity, with something far more dangerous. Emily happened to catch that gaze when she reached for her water. His eyes moved across her only briefly, but in that fleeting moment she saw something flicker in them. Recognition? Interest? She could not be sure, but his eyes immediately returned to Brandon, cold and unblinking. He had heard everything. Of course he had. Brandon never lowered his voice. Heat flushed through Emily's cheeks. Enduring this nightmare was already unbearable, but having someone witness it? That was worse. She shrank into her chair, wishing she could disappear. Maybe if she stayed quiet and perfectly still, this moment would pass. Brandon would calm down. They would finish dinner. And maybe, just maybe, when they got home, he would forget his threat. She knew better. But hope was a stubborn thing. And if you felt that moment too, the instant the stranger's eyes locked onto Brandon, like a sign that the 3-year nightmare Emily had lived through was about to veer in another direction. Please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share the video so we can continue bringing you these breath-catching, deeply emotional stories each day. And tell me, where are you watching from? Leave a comment with your city or your country so I can see. Which corner of this vast world Emily's search for hope has reached? Emily had never imagined she would become this kind of woman, the kind who measured every word, every glance, every lift of a fork at dinner, as if each movement were a hidden trap that might detonate the anger of the man across from her. But 3 years with Brandon had shaped her into exactly that, a survival machine. Someone who learned to shrink herself to fit inside his expectations. She could not recall exactly when it started. He had been charming at first, successful, funny, someone who knew how to make her feel wanted. He was a lawyer, skilled in speaking, in persuasion, even more skilled at controlling others without them noticing. The little suggestions at the beginning seemed harmless enough. You should wear your hair straight. It looks more mature. Avoid red dresses. They make your skin look pale. When are you moving in with me? It saves rent, makes everything easier. Emily had mistaken it for care. Only later did she understand they were the first steps toward control. When she moved in with Brandon, everything in the apartment was already arranged. Her belongings occupied a single corner of the closet. Everything else bore his imprint. Her schedule changed next. He disliked her eating dinner with coworkers, especially men. He disliked short skirts or red lipstick. And, naturally, he disliked her best friend Rachel. Too opinionated, too rude, a bad influence on Emily. Slowly, his reminders became restrictions. His arguments became threats. And Emily, somehow, went from being independent and strong to someone who apologized constantly for things she could not name. Once, she overslept by 10 minutes because her alarm failed. Brandon said nothing the entire morning. He slammed the door when leaving, shattering her coffee mug on the floor. That night he told her she was irresponsible, selfish, ungrateful. She cried, apologized, cleaned the mess, and stayed up till midnight, preparing his lunch for the next day. Whenever she tried to speak up, he twisted everything, turning her into the villain. He was so skilled at manipulation that she started doubting herself. Maybe she really was thoughtless. Maybe she needed to adjust her attitude. Maybe if she tried harder, he would be gentle again, like in the beginning. But that never happened. He always found something wrong, whether in her tone, her gaze, or the direction her shoes faced. The weight of it exhausted her, buried her, filled her with a guilt she could not shake. And still, she stayed. Part fear, part shame. She did not want anyone to know she had chosen wrong. She did not want her mother disappointed, or Rachel to say, "I told you so." She had nowhere to go, and fewer people she trusted. Brandon knew that. He used it to lock her in place. Tonight, he was doing it again. A dinner he planned, at a restaurant he chose, with clothes he suggested, and a dish he ordered for her. The pasta was not what Emily wanted, but Brandon insisted she eat it, because women should avoid anything too creamy if they want to keep their figure. When she said she wanted something else, he gave a cool laugh and replied, "I know you better than you know yourself." Now, after his threat in the middle of the restaurant, after the horrifying expression on his face, after the grip that left her wrist throbbing, all she could do was sit still and breathe carefully, desperate not to make another mistake. She felt like an object he owned. Not a fiancé, not a partner, but property he could command, correct, and punish. When Brandon pulled out his phone and checked his messages, ignoring her for a few seconds, Emily glanced around the restaurant for the first time that night. The man at the next table was still there, sipping his wine quietly. His dark suit, his relaxed yet alert posture, the way his eyes had cut through Brandon only moments before she could still feel the ripple of it. Not pity, not curiosity, a warning, as if he had seen far too many scenes like this, as if he did not intend to look away. And for the first time in a very long while, in a fleeting, fragile instant, Emily felt something she had thought was gone forever. Hope. Brandon rose from the table, tossing his napkin aside with that familiar flash of irritation, then leaned in close to Emily's ear, his breath hot against her skin and making her shiver. "Do not even think about walking away," he growled, before turning and heading toward the restroom. Emily finally exhaled, a deep, shaky breath that felt as though it had been trapped inside her chest all evening. Her hand still trembled, and her wrist throbbed where he had gripped her, as if she were a misbehaving child needing discipline. She lifted her water glass toward her lips, but before she could take a sip, a movement across from her made her freeze. The man at the next table, the one who had watched everything from the beginning, was standing, up, He was not hurried, not loud. He simply lifted his glass of red wine, stepped over to her table, and sat down in Brandon's chair as though he had every right to claim the space. Emily jolted, her thoughts scattering into a whirlwind of half-formed questions. Who was he? What was he doing? But the man did not look at her immediately. He set his wine down, folded his arms calmly, and only then did his eyes meet hers. "My name is Nick," he said, his voice deep, steady, touched by an Italian undertone she could not immediately place. "And you need to listen to me very carefully, because your boyfriend will be back here in less than 2 minutes." Emily opened her mouth, but only a whisper escaped. "Please, you do not understand. If he sees you sitting here—" "He will not do anything tonight," Nick interrupted, his tone never rising, yet carrying the weight of complete certainty. It was not reassurance. It was truth spoken as plainly as the sky is blue. Emily shook her head, glancing toward the hallway leading to the restroom. "You do not know Brandon. I know men like him very well," Nick replied, his gaze steady, his voice slow and deliberate, as though each word was being chosen with care. "I have met hundreds of men like him. They are all the same. They choose gentle women, kind women, and break them piece by piece until nothing is left but fear." Something in the way he spoke, some old grief buried deep inside him, made Emily's throat tighten. "I am fine," she whispered, repeating the same sentence she had used for her mother, for Rachel, for the coworker who once asked about the bruise on her arm. "Really, I am fine. He just gets a little heated sometimes, but he does not mean—" "He means every word," Nick said without blinking, "and it will only get worse. You know that." Emily swallowed hard. She did know. God, she did. But logic and reality often lived in separate worlds. "Why do you care?" she asked before she could stop herself. "You do not even know me." For the first time, an unreadable emotion flickered across Nick's face. Call it memory, call it restrained anger, she could not name it. "Maybe because I despise seeing men like him threaten women in public," he said. Through the window behind him, she saw Brandon returning, his posture rigid with tension. Her heart thudded violently. "Please, you have to leave right now. If he sees you here—" "Let him see," Nick said, still calm. "You do not understand. I understand perfectly." He did not look toward the hallway. He did not need to. "The question is, do you want help, or do you plan to keep pretending that this is love?" The words struck her like a slap of cold air. Before she could answer, Brandon was back. His face was flushed, his eyes wild when he saw Nick sitting there. "What the hell is going on?" he roared. "Who the hell are you?" Nick rose slowly, like a predator that had no need to rush. He was taller than Brandon by a few inches, broader at the shoulders, and when the two stood face to face, Emily saw something she had never seen in Brandon before. Fear. "I am the man who just listened to you threaten her," Nick said, his voice low but sharp as a blade, "and I thought I should come say hello." "This is none of your business," Brandon snapped, fists curling. "Emily, get your things. We are leaving." Emily began to rise automatically. "Yes, of course, obey, follow, go." But Nick's voice cut through the moment. "She is not going anywhere tonight." The restaurant fell utterly silent. The servers froze where they stood. The diners pretended not to notice while their eyes drifted toward the scene. Brandon barked out a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Who the hell do you think you are?" "Nick Romano." The name dropped between them like a stone into deep water. Emily saw Brandon's face change instantly, anger collapsing into uncertainty, then fear. "Romano?" Brandon repeated, voice cracking. "As in, that Romano?" "Yes," Nick said. "And she will not be leaving with you. Not tonight. Not ever again." The air inside the restaurant thickened, as if someone had shut off the ventilation. No one chewed. No silverware clinked. Only Brandon's ragged breathing and Nick's razor-edged stare remained. Emily stood frozen beside the table, her heart pounding, not out of fear of what Brandon might do, but because for the first time she saw the man trembling. Brandon glanced around, desperate for someone to intervene, but no one moved. The servers avoided his gaze. The diners studied their wine glasses or menus, though every eye was still on them. Nick remained still, his posture relaxed, but his gaze anchored to Brandon with a chilling warning. I did not know," Brandon stammered, trying to reclaim his usual swagger. I did not know who you were. I just thought, she is my fiancé. Our business is private. Nothing is private when you scream in her face in a restaurant, when you intimidate her and squeeze her wrist as if she belongs to you, Nick said, his voice soft but each word falling like iron onto the marble floor. I meant no harm, Brandon insisted, scrambling to assemble his polite facade. We have been together for 3 years. It was just a misunderstanding. She knows I lose my temper sometimes, but I would never. Nick turned to Emily, his voice gentler. Is that true? Was it just a misunderstanding? Emily looked at Brandon. The man she once loved, once tried to fix, once hoped she could save. But now, standing before her, he was no longer powerful or terrifying. He was exposed, shaking, pitiful. His eyes begged her. Say something, Emily. Tell him it was a misunderstanding. Tell him you want to go home. Every eye in the restaurant was on her. Her heart raced. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that one step would change her entire life. She looked at Brandon, then at Nick. One man was the darkness she had endured. The other was a stranger who saw her when she wished to be invisible, yet stood up for her without needing a reason. No, Emily said, at first barely audible. Brandon frowned. What? No, she repeated, her voice stronger. It is not a misunderstanding. I do not want to go home with you. I do not want to live another day in fear. Brandon stared at her as though she had spoken in a foreign language. You are being manipulated, he spat. He set this up. He is trying to separate you from me. You belong to me, Emily, you belong to me. Nick stepped forward, his expression darkening. She does not belong to anyone, and she just said no. Brandon lunged to grab her, but he never made contact. In the span of a heartbeat, Nick's hand closed around Brandon's wrist and twisted just enough to make him cry out. If you touch her again, Nick said slowly, you will lose this hand. Do we understand each other? Brandon nodded rapidly, lips pressed tight to choke back the pain. Nick released him, and Brandon stumbled backward, his face flushed with pain and humiliation. 2 men in dark suits appeared, seemingly from nowhere, stepping to Brandon's sides. They did not threaten or speak, but their cold, immovable presence made the message unmistakable. Nick turned to Emily. His name? Brandon, she whispered, her throat dry. Nick nodded. Escort Mr. Brandon outside, and make sure he does not step foot in any place I own or influence again. In this city, that number is not small. The 2 men nodded, moving beside Brandon like heavy shadows. Brandon looked back at Emily as he reached the door, his eyes filled with rage, hurt, and disbelief. This is not over. You hear me? This is not the end. One of the suited men said something short and low, and Brandon went silent, the door closed behind him. Inside the restaurant, the soft music resumed, silverware tapped gently against porcelain, and life moved on as if nothing had happened. But for Emily, everything had changed. Emily stood there, barely aware of her own legs anymore. Everything had happened too fast, too forcefully, as if someone had ripped a heavy curtain from her life and exposed the truth she had spent years avoiding. Brandon had vanished through the restaurant doors, escorted out by 2 men in dark suits like a small-time troublemaker, and she could still hear the echo of his shout that this was not over. But what made her heart pound was not his threat. It was the tiny word she had spoken, the one that had slipped from her lips for the first time after years of being cornered in the dark. No. 2 simple, fragile syllables, sharp as a blade slicing through the rope that had bound her for 3 long years. No. Every time Brandon raged, she apologized. Every time he tightened his grip on her life, she reminded herself to endure. Every time he squeezed her wrist, leaving no marks but plenty of pain, she convinced herself she must have done something wrong. But tonight, in the middle of a fine restaurant where she was supposed to smile and stay quiet as usual, she had said no. And Nick was the only person who did not hear weakness in that word. He heard a choice, a declaration. When the restaurant door finally shut and the sound of Brandon's footsteps faded, Nick remained there, not touching her, not crowding her, simply watching her with a calmness that felt impossible. Are you all right? Emily opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her throat was blocked by 1,000 emotions fighting their way up. Fear, relief, confusion, and something else, something unfamiliar. the feeling of being seen. I do not know," she whispered. Nick nodded, never pushing. "Of course. No one expects you to know what to do right now." That was what unsettled her most. Brandon always demanded immediate reactions, always forced her to choose, to explain, to beg, to apologize. Nick just stood there, willing to wait. Dizziness washed over her. Everything around her, the laughter from nearby tables returning slowly, the warm golden glow of the restaurant, all seemed to drift backward like scenery pulling away from a train. She braced herself against the table for balance. Nick took one step forward yet kept his distance. "Emily, breathe." Her breaths were uneven, but she obeyed. One breath, then another. The scent of wine, the restaurant's cologne of candles and linen, the quiet clinking of forks blending with her own tight breathing, all reminded her that she was alive, upright, choosing. Brandon could not touch her now, and maybe he never would again. Nick watched her like a doctor assessing whether a patient could still stand. When he saw her steady herself slightly, he asked, "Do you want to leave this place?" Emily looked around. The place that had hosted hundreds of tense dinners with Brandon had now become the place where she saved herself with two small words she thought she could never say. She nodded softly. Yes. Nick did not place a hand on her back to guide her. He simply walked ahead, opening a path, allowing her to follow on her own, and that small act made her want to cry, not because of pain, but because freedom had brushed her fingertips for the first time. When they reached the door, the cold night air swept over her like a jolt back into her own body. She tightened her fingers around her small purse. Just her. She was enough to move her own feet. Nick stood beside her without speaking, letting her breathe. "You did the bravest thing tonight," Nick said gently, as if stating a simple fact. Emily shook her head. I could not take it anymore. Whatever the reason, you still chose to stand up. No one else did that for you." Emily did not reply. She looked down at her shoes, then at the restaurant door behind her. For some reason, her chest felt lighter. As though she had just set down a heavy suitcase she had carried for so long, it had become a part of her body. For the first time in years, she was not trembling from fear. She trembled because she was stepping into something she had never believed she deserved. A beginning. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, the door opening with a soft click, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Nick leaned in to say something to the driver, then turned back to her. "Do you want to go home?" She opened her mouth, yet no answer came. That simple question froze her in place. Home. But where was that? Brandon's apartment still held her clothes, her documents, her laptop, her belongings, her memories. But it was not home. It had never truly been home. She nodded weakly, staring at the pavement. I do not know where I should go right now." Nick said nothing more. He simply extended his hand, not touching her, just offering. She stepped into the car, and he sat beside her, keeping a respectful distance. The silence inside the car felt strangely gentle. Streetlights slid past the windows in broken streaks, illuminating Emily's face in flickers of gold and shadow. She sat upright, hands clasped, fingers icy. Her thoughts churned in a chaotic storm. Even after saying no, even after Brandon had been taken away, she felt as though she sat in a room full of smoke. The panic did not show on her face, but it wove through every breath. Nick watched her quietly before asking in a soft voice, "Are you afraid?" She nodded, because opening her mouth felt like something might shatter. "Do you think you did something wrong?" She looked up at him. "No. One word, but I am still scared. I do not know what comes next. I do not know what he will do. I do not know if he will come back, and I do not know if I am strong enough to keep going." Nick tilted his head, his voice deep and steady like stone. "Fear is not failure. Fear means you understand how dangerous what you just survived truly was. And the fact that you are still here, breathing, talking, is proof that you are stronger than he ever believed." Emily stared at him, fighting the burn behind her eyes. "I do not know why you are doing this, why you stepped in. You do not know me. You have no reason." Nick was silent for a few seconds. "Someone close to me went through something similar, and I did not notice soon enough. She suffered far longer than she should have before I finally saw it. I swore I would never make that mistake again if I ever had the chance." His gaze softened. Tonight, I saw you. Not just your situation. You, a woman trying to make herself invisible so she would not set off an explosion. I could not look away. Emily turned toward the window. The streets of Chicago drifted by slowly like an old film reel. She wanted to believe him. Part of her already did. But another part still trembled, remembering every time she had thought she was safe only to be pulled back into darkness. When the car stopped in front of a small residential building, she frowned. This was not Brandon's apartment. Nick opened the car door but did not step out. A safe hotel. Someone I know owns it. They have been informed you are coming. No one knows you are here. No one can trace you. You do not have to worry tonight. Emily did not know what to say. She sat there, drowning in confusion and gratitude. I do not have any cash. I cannot. You do not need to pay anything, Nick said gently but firmly. I am not helping you to get something in return. I just do not want you to lie down tonight with fear beside you. She stared at him, not to judge him, but trying to believe the words were true. Then she nodded. Thank you. Only 2 words, but they came from the deepest place inside her. Nick gave a faint smile. Tomorrow, when you are ready, we will talk again. Tonight, you rest. He did not wait for her reply before closing the car door and letting her walk into the hotel alone. The front desk staff had already been informed. Everything was quiet, discreet, efficient. When the door to her room closed behind her, Emily leaned back against the wall. She did not turn on the light. Standing in the darkness, her heart still fluttering unevenly, she listened to the silence. For the first time in years, she was somewhere without Brandon's shadow, without his voice controlling every breath, without locked doors or footsteps pounding through the night. And in that quiet, trembling though she was, she could finally breathe. The next morning, the first light slipped through the narrow gap of the hotel curtains and washed the room in a soft golden glow. Emily opened her eyes with a strange sense of disorientation, her head heavy as stone and her body feeling as though it had weathered a storm. But when she sat up, there were no angry footsteps pacing the doorway, no sharp eyes waiting to interrogate her, no accusations, no control, only silence, a silence that did not suffocate. When she stepped out of bed, her phone chimed softly. A message appeared from an unsaved number. Good morning. I hope you managed to sleep a little. I will be at the hotel at 9 o'clock if you want to talk. If not, I will return at another time. No pressure. Nick. Emily stared at the message for several seconds, that same mixture of confusion and gratitude twisting inside her. She did not know what waited for her next, but she knew one thing. She could not return to that apartment. She could not go back to a place where every corner echoed threats, control, and sleepless nights. At exactly 9, there was a knock at the door. She opened it wearing the thin hotel robe, her hair unbrushed and falling loosely over her shoulders. Nick stood there holding 2 hot coffees. He handed one to her and stepped inside without scanning the room, without unnecessary questions, setting a paper bag of pastries on the table before taking a seat by the window. Can you eat breakfast? Emily nodded faintly. Maybe a small bite, she said, her voice rough from a night spent saying almost nothing. Nick waited until she took a sip of coffee before he began. I sent people to Brandon's apartment this morning. They will gather all your belongings, pack everything carefully, catalog it, and move it to a secure location. You do not need to go back there. Emily set the cup down, her hands clasping tightly. How did you do that? I have a team that handles things like this. They are discreet, efficient, invisible. No one knows who they are, not even the building manager. And the hallway cameras have already been dealt with, so Brandon cannot track anything. She went still. Part of her felt so relieved she wanted to cry. Another part trembled with the fear of stepping into a world that moved too smoothly under Nick's quiet command. A world he seemed to navigate effortlessly, as if he had done this 100 times. I do not know what to say, she whispered. You do not need to say anything. And if you worry about legality, everything has been arranged within safe boundaries. He cannot sue or accuse anyone of anything. Nick paused, then continued. You can decide later where you want your things delivered. For now, they will be kept in a private storage unit, secured with a code. No one has access but you and me. Emily bowed her head, a single tear sliding silently down her cheek. You do not owe me anything, Nick. You do not have to do all of this. I know, but I want to. Not out of pity. Not out of guilt. Because I saw you hurting and I knew I could help. That is all." She studied him for a long moment. For the first time, she looked at him directly instead of shrinking away. "Do you usually help women like this?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Nick was silent for a moment. "No. I do not get involved in other people's lives unless they want me to. But last night, I could not stay seated. There was something about you that made me stand up. Not for reputation, not for morality. Just because if I had turned away, I would have had to live with that feeling for a long time." Emily said nothing. She had no strength left to argue, and no reason left to hide behind a shell. All she knew was that this morning, instead of facing a man who frightened her with his eyes alone, she was sitting across from a man quietly offering her a way out. And that, just that, made her breathe easier. When Nick stood to leave, he paused at the door and set a small phone on the table. "This is a new number, registered anonymously. If Brandon tries to contact you, or if he appears anywhere near you, you only press one button. Someone will come immediately." Emily picked it up, her hands trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. Nick nodded. "Rest. When you are ready, let me know what you want next." Then he left, closing the door behind him, leaving her alone with her cooling coffee and the small phone resting in her palm like a promise that she would never be alone again. That afternoon, Emily left the hotel through a back exit, a knit hat pulled low over half her face, and dark glasses hiding the rest, as if she were trying to slip away from the entire world. The familiar black car carried her out of the city center, past the bustling Chicago streets drenched in autumn colors, leaves scattered across the sidewalks, like soft, rust-colored carpets. She did not ask where they were going. She only knew Nick had arranged a temporary refuge, quiet and safe, untouched by any memory of Brandon. When the car stopped before a 2-story vintage house in the suburbs, with its moss-green roof and balcony overflowing with plants, she finally looked up with real attention. Rachel was standing on the porch, arms crossed, her expression equal parts anger and worry, but the anger vanished the instant she saw Emily step out of the car. Rachel rushed to her, pulled her into a crushing hug. Holding her so tightly, Emily felt tears rise instantly. No accusation. No, I told you so. Only warmth, and a trembling whisper against her ear. "I was so scared I would never see you again." Emily sagged into the embrace, her whole body trembling. "I thought that too." Nick stayed a few steps back, hands in his pockets, watching with quiet understanding, as if he knew this moment did not belong to Tim. When Emily's eyes met his, she gave a small nod. He nodded back, then turned away without a word. Rachel led her inside, into a living room that looked exactly the same as their old college movie nights. The burgundy sofa, the vintage patterned floor lamp, the slightly crooked wooden framed photo on the wall. The familiarity of it tightened Emily's throat. The scent of mint and freshly baked cookies drifted from the kitchen, and for the first time in months, she entered a space where she did not need to shrink herself to fit. Rachel handed her soft pajamas and a lavender-scented towel. "Stay as long as you need. Do not ask questions. Do not thank me. I am not Nick, but I am the first person who knew your worth." Emily managed a thin smile. "I do not even know who I am anymore. You are the woman who walked away. That alone makes you strong." That night, they sprawled on the sofa, watching old movies. Neither of them truly followed. Emily did not remember the plot. She remembered the feeling of lying beside someone who did not judge her, did not interrogate her after every sentence, did not stare at her plate as though waiting for a mistake. She ate a slice of pizza, without needing permission. She laughed loudly at a funny scene without fear of being told she was too noisy. And when Rachel fell asleep mid-movie, Emily slipped out to the balcony, wrapped herself in a thin blanket, and looked up at the night sky. No Brandon. No voice dictating her every move, no hand clamping her wrist until the bones ached, no dread coiled inside her every morning. Only the rustling leaves and the soft autumn breeze on her cheek. She set her hand over her heart and felt, for the first time in years, a heartbeat not strangled by anxiety. It was not over. Brandon was somewhere in the city, capable of appearing without warning as he always had. But tonight, here, Emily was allowed to breathe, allowed to exist without asking permission. She looked down at the small phone Nick had given her. No calls, no messages, nothing but silence. For the first time, the silence did not signal a storm. It felt like an invitation to begin again. Emily stayed outside until the chill pushed her back indoors. When she closed the balcony door behind her, she was not just closing a fall night. She was closing an entire chapter of her life. A dark chapter she had finally stepped out of. 3 days had passed since Emily moved into Rachel's home, and each morning when she woke, she needed a few seconds to remember that she no longer lived inside the same suffocating loop. No more staring at her phone in fear of a threatening message from Brandon. No more tiptoeing into the kitchen afraid of triggering an unpredictable rage. Instead, there was soft music floating from the Bluetooth speaker in the kitchen, the smell of toasted bread and morning coffee, the sound of Rachel's laughter as she recounted silly office stories. Emily still did not know where she would go next or what she would do, but she was slowly learning how to savor each moment without fear. That afternoon, while Rachel was at work, Emily sat on the porch with a book she could not get past 3 pages of. The breeze played gently with her hair, and a soft sunlight spilled across the wooden steps. Her phone rang, the number unfamiliar and yet familiar. It was Nick. His voice was still deep and calm like the first time she heard it, but this time there was a faint hesitation beneath it. "I hope I am not bothering you." "No," she answered, quicker than she expected. "Are you doing all right?" "All right," in a new and unfamiliar way. There was something like a quiet sigh from the other end. "I just wanted to make sure you have everything you need. My team and I have finished moving all your belongings. Everything is stored safely now. You can collect it any time or wait until you feel ready." "Thank you, truly, thank you, Nick. I do not know how to say it in a way that feels enough." A short silence lingered, before his voice returned, no longer hesitant. "Then maybe you could say that thank you over dinner, only if you are comfortable, no pressure." Emily tightened her grip around the phone, her lips parting as if to speak but no sound forming. Dinner, with Nick. A part of her rose in alarm immediately, like an old reflex clicking into place. But then she remembered the way he had looked at her that night in the restaurant, not as someone fragile, but as someone fighting. She remembered how he kept his distance, how he never touched her even when she trembled, and above all, how he walked away the moment she nodded, without clinging or demanding anything. So she took a breath and said softly, "Yes. Dinner, tomorrow night, perfect. I will pick you up at 7. You do not have to pick me up, I can get there. I think I am ready to take the bus on my own." Nick paused, then let out a quiet laugh. "All right, I will send you the address." And she realized she was smiling too, a real smile, unforced. The next evening, she stood before the mirror for a long time, not to make herself perfect, but because it had been so long since she had chosen an outfit simply because she liked it. She wore a simple, light blue dress, tied her hair neatly, and added a touch of pale pink lipstick. In the mirror, she looked different. Not because of the clothes, but because of her eyes. No longer avoiding, no longer hiding. When she arrived at the small restaurant Nick had chosen, he was standing outside, not checking his phone, not impatient. When he saw her, he smiled. A warm, genuine smile, like the first breath of spring after a long winter. "You made it on time," he said, "and you made it here on your own." Emily nodded gently. Maybe it was just dinner, but for her, it was a milestone, a moment of return, of freedom, of choosing a new beginning not because someone dragged her out of the darkness, but because she had climbed toward the light herself. And Nick, he was simply the one waiting quietly at the top. The restaurant was tucked away in a quiet alley in northern Chicago, its warm gold lighting spilling through the windows and creating a space that felt almost separate from the city shifting into evening outside. Nick had chosen a corner table near the fireplace, far enough from the hum of conversations and clinking glasses that nothing intruded on the space between them. Emily sat across from him, her hands trembling slightly around her glass, yet her gaze far steadier than before. No more darting glances, no hypervigilance in every movement. She sat upright, meeting his eyes, ready to listen, instead of ready to flinch. When the appetizers arrived, Nick nudged the plate toward her. He spoke steadily, without flair or pretense, telling her he had been born in Brooklyn to an Italian family 3 generations removed from their homeland. His father had once been a notorious real estate broker, though beneath the polished exterior lay a complicated network capable of crushing a business overnight with a single misstep. Emily listened, not shocked, but struck by the fact that he spoke of it without concealment. "My mother taught piano," he said. "A gentle woman, strong in ways none of the men around her ever understood. She was the only person who could look my father in the eye and say no, and somehow still make him love her fiercely." Nick smiled faintly at the memory, then his expression dimmed. "I have a younger sister. Her name is Maria. She was once in a relationship like yours. We did not know. Or maybe we did, and pretended not to. Not until she landed in the hospital for the third time, with what she claimed was a fall down the stairs. My mother could not take it anymore. She hired an investigator. And then we learned everything." Emily tightened her hold on her glass. "Where is Maria now?" "In Italy, married, with 2 children and a small cafe by the seaside. It took her nearly 10 years to heal. And it took me just as long to stop blaming myself. I am not saying her story is the same as yours, but that night in the restaurant, I saw in you what I once saw in her, the lost eyes. The hands clenched like you were holding onto something you were not even sure was still there." Emily could not respond. Her heart tightened painfully. Maria's story was not more tragic than her own, but it held something she had never dared believe in: recovery. Nick continued, his voice softer now. "I left my family at 26. Walked away from my father's shadow, from the path laid out for me. I rebuilt everything from the ground up. Some people think I am a traitor. Some think I am a fool. But I could not keep working in a world where fear looked like power. I did not want to live a life where people smiled only because they were afraid of me." Emily stared at him for a long time. There was a quietness between them that was not awkward but necessary, as if she needed to rearrange every piece of who she thought he was. Nick was not a fairy tale hero. He had not rescued her, only to disappear. He was a man carrying his own shadows, his own losses, his own hidden scars, but instead of using them to dominate the world, he used them to protect others. Perhaps that was why he never touched her, never pushed her to speak, never tried to be the solution. He simply opened a door and waited until she was ready to walk through. "What are you thinking?" he asked when her silence lingered too long. "That I have never sat across from a man whose story made me see myself inside it." He nodded, his gaze softening. He said nothing more. He let the space fill with something fragile and real, something like understanding growing quietly between them. Dinner unfolded like that, without needing to define anything. Just 2 people who had both known loss, who had both stood at the edge of their own cliffs, sitting together in a small corner of the world where no one needed armor, and where hope could begin again from a story still damp with tears. 1 week, after the quiet dinner where Emily first heard Nick speak about his past, they sat together again in a small cafe in the West Loop, where large windows gathered the afternoon sunlight filtering through the street trees, and Emily had changed, not in appearance but in the way she inhabited the world, no longer averting her gaze, no longer shrinking as if a single misstep could hurt her. And in her hands, she held a black leather notebook, with the word Phoenix written on the first page in her handwriting. Nick leaned in, skimmed a few lines she showed him, then looked up, his eyes steady, and she told him she had thought a great deal about that name, that a phoenix was the symbol of rebirth, a creature that burned to ash only to rise again, just like women who had been cornered into small dark rooms inside their own lives. Women like her, like his sister, like the thousands who had no idea where to run when fear became the air they breathed. Nick said nothing for a few seconds, only nodded, and she continued, saying she wanted to turn what she had endured into something useful, not for revenge, but to give others a chance, a choice, because she did not want anyone waiting until a gun was pressed into their side in the middle of the night before finding the courage to leave, and she wanted the Phoenix Foundation to be the place people reached long before it was too late. Nick took a sip of coffee, set the cup down, and looked at her not as someone reviewing a proposal, but as someone listening to the rhythm of a heart, learning how to beat again. And when he asked what she needed, she told him a small office, a legal advisory team, a few part-time counselors, and initial funding that would allow them to operate for at least 6 months without depending on donations, and without questioning or adjusting a single detail. He said only one sentence that made her go still. "Let me be the first to invest in Phoenix." She whispered that he did not have to, her fingers tightening around the notebook, saying she owed him nothing. And he replied that he knew, but he believed in what she was building. And that sometimes the best things in life began not from obligation but from trust. A week later, they signed the first papers to establish the Phoenix Foundation, the temporary office located in a quiet building on the west side, with 3 workrooms, a small lounge, and a private counseling space. And Emily stood in the empty room holding the new keys with her palm damp with nerves as Rachel arrived first with chairs and coffee mugs. And Nick came later carrying a framed picture of a phoenix rising through dust and charred earth, telling her she did not need to begin with perfection, only begin. And Emily touched the frame, feeling her throat tighten, because each time she thought she had nothing left to give, Nick said something that made her want to take another step, not because he pushed her, but because he believed she could. When the Phoenix Foundation opened its doors, Emily made no grand announcement, only posted a simple line on her private social media. For anyone who has ever believed there was no way out, the way she once believed. And in the early days, only a few calls came in. One woman whose voice trembled as she asked if anyone there understood what it felt like to love the person who was hurting her. A young student who said she did not need help, only a kind voice. And each message felt like a piece of proof that Emily had chosen the right path. For she was no longer the frightened woman at a fancy dinner table, but the one sitting behind a wooden desk, listening, understanding, and reaching out to those caught between pain and hope. Nick sometimes stopped by with coffee, or simply sat quietly in the office, not asking questions or interfering, just being there like a rooted tree waiting for a phoenix to find its wings. And with each passing day, Emily was learning how to stretch her own. On a spring afternoon, that year, sunlight streamed through the office window, in long pale bars across the wooden floor, as Emily reviewed the file of a young woman who had called earlier. Each new story opening a door into a darkness that once terrified her, but one she now stepped toward with steady eyes and a heart that no longer flinched. And when the bell above the door chimed softly, Nick walked in carrying 2 coffees but paused in the middle of the room, simply looking at her before saying she looked different today. And when she asked how, he said she looked like someone who had finally chosen her place in the world, someone who no longer bowed her head. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes filled with emotions she never imagined she would feel for a man again. Not the kind born of dependency or fear of losing someone, but a tenderness grown slowly from trust and mutual respect, like a seed once wilted and finally nurtured back to life. And when Nick sat across from her and reached into the pocket of his coat to pull out a small worn velvet box, not shiny or branded, something so simple that her heartbeat slowed at the sight, he opened it to reveal a delicate gold ring with a tiny emerald gleaming softly, and he said it had belonged to his mother, that she had worn it for 42 years of marriage to his father, not because the marriage had been perfect, but because she believed that the most precious things endured only through patience and honesty, and that she once told him true love never makes you feel smaller, but allows you to become larger in your own eyes. Emily touched the ring with trembling fingertips, whispering that she did not know what to say, and he told her she did not need to say anything now, that he did not need a rushed answer, only wanted her to know that each day he watched her do what she believed in, loving the way she was strong and gentle at once, and growing surer that he wanted to walk beside her for the rest of the road. She looked into his eyes, and found no promise of perfection, only an invitation to continue forward together, equal, neither pulling the other, and she admitted she had once believed love was just another form of control, a trap disguised as sweetness. But now she understood that love does not confine. It grants flight, allowing her to go farther, stronger, without sacrificing herself to stay. And Nick smiled softly, as though he had always known she would understand on a day like this. She did not say yes, nor did she slip the ring onto her finger, but she closed her hand around the velvet box as if holding something sacred, and that night they sat together on Rachel's balcony, the same balcony that had been her first refuge after she escaped, and Emily set the ring box on the small table and let the moonlight touch the green stone, whispering that she did not need a grand ceremony, only the certainty that when she fell there would be someone who reached out not to pull her up but to wait while she rose in, her own way. And Nick said nothing, only held her hand gently, and in that quiet moment both of them knew they were no longer 2 broken fragments searching for each other in chaos, but 2 people who had once fallen apart and now chose to rebuild side by side from the ashes, just like the name Emily had given her foundation, and the truest definition of the love they were beginning to write together. 3 weeks after Emily accepted Nick's proposal, life seemed to be settling into a gentle, almost deceptively peaceful rhythm. The Phoenix Foundation was running steadily. The first women she and her team had supported were beginning to stand on their own, and the small apartment she shared temporarily with Rachel had become a space filled with morning laughter, the smell of toasted bread in the afternoons, and quiet evenings where she and Nick sat together without needing many words. Yet it was always in the moments that felt safest that old storms found their way back. On Monday morning, when Emily opened her email, she saw a familiar name buried among the usual messages. Brandon. No subject line, no greeting, only one sentence. You changed your number, changed your address, even changed yourself, but I still know who you belong to. She closed the email immediately, her hand going cold as her breath turned unsteady. She tried to tell herself it was only an empty threat, a shadow from the past rising out of habit, but when she stepped outside her office, she saw a bouquet waiting at the door, white roses. The kind Brandon always claimed symbolized purity, forgiveness, and belonging to him. No card, no note. He did not need one. The moment she saw them, she knew. One day later, Rachel called from home. A nameless envelope had arrived with an old photograph of Emily and Brandon at a party. It was not a picture she ever kept. Someone had dug it up, found the address, and sent it at precisely the right moment. Nick immediately ordered a review of every camera near the house and the office. He added security, installed new locks, upgraded the Phoenix Foundation system with facial recognition access, but he did not speak much about it. He made no promises of absolute safety. He only told her he would stay, that he would walk through this with her, step by step. Yet what kept Emily awake was not what Brandon sent, but what those reminders awakened inside her. The old anxiety crept back like a tenacious shadow. She began to flinch whenever someone stood too close. She checked the locks 3 times before bed. Every unfamiliar sound in the hallway tightened her whole body. Part of her knew she was no longer the woman trembling in that dark car after the night that had changed everything. But another part, the one that had once been broken down, piece by careful piece, was not fully asleep. One evening, when Nick arrived to take her home, Emily brought him into the office and pointed to her computer screen. He sent another one, she whispered, and on the screen was a new email, this time with an audio file attached. She had not opened it, but the line in the message made her shiver. Your voice when you cry is still what I remember most. Nick said nothing. He simply saved everything onto a drive and sent it straight to his technical team. Then he sat across from her and held her hand in quiet steadiness. Do you want to step back for a while? No. Emily shook her head. If I retreat now, I am giving him exactly what he wants. I cannot let the Phoenix Foundation be a place where I am strong only when I am not being threatened. I want the women who come here to see that they can stand even when their past tries to claw its way back. Nick looked at her, unable to hide the mix of pride and worry in his eyes. Then I will be here, every day, every step, no matter what happens. That night, Emily sat alone in her room, opened the drawer, and took out the small brown velvet box with the old ring inside. She lifted the lid not to wear it, but to look at the emerald stone, as if it were a reminder of something she could not afford to forget. Love does not make you smaller. Real love helps you grow larger within your own eyes. Brandon could send emails, could place flowers, could claw his way back into the edges of her life, but the one thing he could never reclaim was the woman she had become. The woman who had learned to say no, who had chosen to rise, who now stood inside the storm without stepping back. Brandon had returned, but she was no longer the Emily he had once broken. That night, the wind raked through the trees outside the small house where she was staying, turning the already tense air into something heavier. Rachel was away on a 3-day business trip, and Nick had just returned from a long meeting, promising to come early in the morning to reassess security measures. Emily believed she could handle one night alone. The house had new locks, new cameras, even motion sensors Nick had installed. Without telling her, she made herself a cup of tea and settled by the window to read a new case file for the Phoenix Foundation. The slow tick of the wall clock made the room feel almost peaceful until her phone buzzed with an alert. Motion detected in the front yard. Emily froze and opened the camera app Nick had installed. A man stood at the gate. Even as a shadow under the streetlight, she recognized him instantly. Brandon. He stood still for a few seconds as if listening for something. Then he moved closer. Emily shot up, locked every door, checked each latch, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped her keys. She reached for her phone just as a knock hit the front door. Not loud or rushed, but steady, measured, chilling. "Baby, I know you are in there." Emily stumbled backward, pressing a hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. Brandon was not shouting like he used to. His voice was low, murky, dangerous in a new way. "We need to talk. You cannot hide forever. I need closure." She did not respond. The knocking shifted into the sound of a doorknob testing itself against the lock. Emily flinched. She ran into the bedroom, grabbed her phone, and called Nick. He answered before the first ring finished. "Emily." His voice hardened instantly. "What is happening? Brandon, he is outside." Nick paused for only a second, and when he spoke again his voice was steel. "Lock every door. Stay away from the windows. I am coming." "No, do not come. It is too dangerous. Let your team handle it first. I am calling them now." She heard him tapping furiously at a keyboard, and then his voice returned, low and controlled. 5 minutes. They will be there in 5 minutes. You hide in the room and do not open that door for anyone. Do you hear me?" She nodded, even though he could not see her. "Yes, I hear you, but everything happened too fast." A sharp crash rang out from the living room, like glass shattering under force. Emily dropped to the floor in shock, her heart pounding. Against her ribs, Brandon shouted, no longer pretending calm. "Emily, get out here. We need to talk. You owe me an explanation." Then she heard the sound she would remember for the rest of her life. The cold, metallic clack of someone chambering around. She could almost smell the metal, smell the fear she once lived with for years, returning like smoke. Brandon had brought a gun. Emily crawled beneath the bed, trembling so violently she could barely keep her breath silent. "Emily." His voice moved through the house, anger and desperation mixing into something feral. "I do not want to hurt you. I just need you to remember who you belong to." She closed her eyes, holding back tears she could not let fall, but another crash erupted, this time the living room window giving way. Emily went still. She listened as his footsteps crossed the broken glass. He was inside the house, slowly, dragging through the air like someone listening to each trembling breath. Brandon's voice rose again. "I know, you're scared. But you scared me more when you disappeared like that. We had 3 years, Emily, 3 years. And you think you can erase that?" She pressed her hand over her mouth as his footsteps moved closer down the hall, relentless and heavy. A faint sound came from behind the house, then the crunch of shoes on gravel. Brandon stopped. Someone else was outside. Emily heard the back door being yanked, heard Brandon curse under his breath, and in that exact moment another voice broke through, not from her phone but from the living room itself. "Brandon." Nick's voice was clear, steady, and sharp as a blade. "Put the gun down." Emily's legs trembled so violently she could no longer feel them. Brandon roared, "Get out." "This is none of your business." "Wrong," Nick replied. "It became my business the moment you threatened her in that restaurant." Footsteps collided, breath quickened. The wooden floor creaked beneath 2 bodies squaring off. Emily held her breath as the worst moment of her life unfolded. Brandon screamed, "Who the hell do you think you are? I'm the man she chose, and I'm the man who's ending this." Then sirens wailed outside, blue and red lights flashing through the window, and Brandon panicked, shouting as the gun clattered to the floor. Emily heard the struggle, the thud of bodies, Brandon's guttural cry of desperation, and then a stillness so complete it felt like the world stopped for a full lifetime. Nick's team burst into the house. Orders echoed through every room. "Emily, Emily, where are you?" Nick's voice was frantic in a way she had never heard from him. She crawled out from beneath the bed, her voice barely audible. "I'm here." And when Nick rushed into the room and wrapped his arms around her, Emily knew she had survived the darkest moment of her life. But she also knew this wasn't the ending. It was only the opening line of the final reckoning. Brandon was restrained and disarmed in the living room while police lights flickered harshly across the walls. Nick kept Emily pulled close, his arms forming a shield around her as security personnel and officers swept the house to ensure there were no other threats. Emily couldn't stop shaking. Though she remained conscious, breathing, and aware of Nick's worried, steady gaze, Her body curled inward as if afraid that letting go for even a moment would cause her to collapse back into darkness. Brandon was handcuffed, his face twisted, no longer the smug, controlling man she once feared, but someone furious and frightened. As officers led him past her, he bowed his head yet still found a way to hiss through clenched teeth. "We're not finished." Nick stepped forward instantly, blocking Brandon's view of her entirely, his voice frozen like ice. "Yes. It finished a long time ago. You were just too stupid to notice." Brandon shouted something incoherent as police dragged him out, his voice fading when the car door slammed shut. Emily stood motionless, staring at the empty space where he had vanished. Nick turned to her, his hand cupping her cheek. "Emily, look at me. I'm here. You're safe." But she could not speak. Her lips parted but no sound came. Nick pulled her into his arms again, and this time she collapsed against him, sobbing uncontrollably, releasing every tear she had swallowed for months, every fear, every humiliation, every nightmare she had tried to bury beneath strength. The next morning, Nick took Emily to the Phoenix Foundation, where everyone waited with warm arms and worried eyes. Rachel hugged her tightly and said nothing, simply becoming the anchor Emily needed. Emily sat in her office, exhausted and lightheaded, but unwilling to leave. She told Nick, "I need to face this." No hiding. Nick didn't argue. He handed her a cup of hot ginger tea and stayed by her side, silent but watchful, like a guardian standing at the threshold of a storm-battered heart. That afternoon, Brandon was brought to court, charged with breaking, entering, unlawful possession of a firearm, and threatening another person's life. The Phoenix Foundation filed its records, the emails, the audio files, the surveillance footage, and Emily's formal statement. During the preliminary hearing, Emily sat next to her attorney, while Nick sat directly behind her, never letting his eyes leave her. When Brandon entered the room, his stare was full of challenge, but this time Emily did not look away. She faced him head-on, without hatred, without fear, only with clarity. He had taken so much from her once, but no longer. Nick stood when it was his turn to testify. His voice was low, steady, and without theatrics. "I've watched this woman rise from a place most people never return from. I've watched her protect others while healing herself. And I know that without proper legal protection, she and many like her will continue to live in fear. No one should have to live that way." When the hearing ended, Emily stepped outside and looked up, at Chicago's gray sky, feeling something lighter in her chest. Nick joined her, his hand settling gently on her shoulder like an anchor she could hold or release as she wished. "You did it," he whispered. "Not for me, not for anyone else, but because you chose to stand." Emily smiled faintly, her eyes still swollen. "I don't know who I'll be tomorrow, but today, I know I'm not afraid anymore." Nick didn't respond. He only took her hand, and in that simple touch was everything they didn't need to say out loud. Brandon may have returned, may have carried threats and shadows back into her world, but this time Emily was not alone. And more importantly, she was no longer the woman who let someone else define her worth. She was the woman who had chosen freedom, who had confronted her past, and who now stood firmly in her own present. Nick had not come to save her. He had come to stand beside her while she saved herself. And that, she finally understood, was what real protection truly meant. 3 months after Brandon was arrested for breaking in and carrying an illegal weapon, the formal trial opened at the Central Chicago District Courthouse beneath a muted early autumn sky. Emily sat in the front row in a light gray suit, her hair neatly pinned back, and her eyes clearer than they had ever been before. She did not come as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a woman who had chosen to face the past and seal it shut for good. Brandon was brought in between 2 officers, thinner than before, but with the same familiar disdain in his eyes. He tried to catch Emily's gaze, as if searching for fear in her face, but this time he found nothing. No trembling, no avoidance, only a steady, calm look, as though she had finally placed a period at the end of a long, haunting sentence. The prosecutor presented the evidence, all meticulously prepared, recordings of his threats, the messages and emails he had sent for weeks, the footage of him breaking in and raising a gun inside, Rachel's home, statements from Nick's security team, and the long psychological damage Emily had endured. Brandon's lawyer tried claiming emotional instability, even suggesting his actions were the result of wounded affection, but none of it mattered in the face of such clarity and the unwavering steadiness in Emily's testimony. When it was her turn to speak, she rose, her voice resonating through the still room. I did not come here to punish. I came here to close this. I once believed I would always be a shadow in someone else's life, controlled, threatened, and convinced I did not deserve peace. But I learned that fear only has as much power as I allow it to have. Today, I am no longer afraid of Brandon, and I do not want any other woman to live under that same weight. Silence followed, thick and reverent. In the eyes turned toward her, there was recognition and respect. After a brief deliberation, the judge delivered the verdict. Brandon was sentenced to 36 months in prison without parole for threatening a life and possessing an illegal firearm, along with a permanent restraining order forbidding any form of contact with Emily. When the sentence was read, he turned back one last time, but Emily stood and walked away, refusing to let her eyes be pulled backward ever again. Nick waited for her in the hallway, holding a warm cup of ginger tea the way he always did. When Emily stepped out, he simply said, "It's done now." She nodded, needing no more words. They left the courthouse together in the crisp beginning of the season, and on the drive home Emily leaned her head toward the window, watching the leaves begin to turn amber and gold. There was no triumphant shout in her chest, no loud victory, only a quiet release, like laying down a stone she had carried on her back for years. That evening, Rachel cooked a small dinner at home with Nick and a few close friends. No one mentioned Brandon. No one had to. They talked about Phoenix, Foundation's future, about the new women seeking help, about hope sprouting where ashes once lay. After dinner, Emily stepped out to the balcony, staring at the peaceful night sky. The wind moved softly, no longer the howling wind of memory, but a gentle whisper that she had passed through the darkest place. The past was still there, but it no longer held the reins. Brandon had been caught, not only by the law but by her own resolve, and to Emily, that was what freedom truly felt like. The next morning, Chicago was washed in a gentle rain, the droplets tapping against the windows of Phoenix Foundation like a steady heartbeat. Emily was arranging files in her office when the doorbell rang. A young woman in her early 20s stood there, her dark brown hair tied in a rushed knot, her eyes wide and frightened. Her jacket was too big, her shoes muddy, and a thin backpack hung from her shoulder. "I'm Kayla," she whispered, barely audible. "I read about Phoenix online. I don't know if this is the right place, but I need help." Emily brought her inside, made her a cup of hot tea, and waited until the trembling in her shoulders eased before speaking gently. "You're safe now. You can say anything, or nothing at all if you're not ready." Kayla bowed her head, her fingers twisting together until they turned pale. "He doesn't hit me often. Only when I make a mistake. Like yesterday. I got home late because the train stalled, and I didn't lock the door fast enough." Emily didn't press her, only handed her a tissue. Kayla looked up, eyes red. "I don't think I'm a victim. He loves me. But lately, I don't recognize myself. I don't speak unless I check his mood. I don't eat what I want. I don't laugh too loudly. And this morning when I woke up, I saw a stranger in the mirror, someone who was scared of her own shadow." Emily sat beside her, not as an expert but as someone who had once stood in the same place. "You're not wrong for feeling that way. You're not crazy, and you're not alone." The words cracked something open, and Kayla burst into tears, as though she had been waiting for someone to say them her whole life. Emily asked a few necessary questions, helped her contact a safe shelter, called a legal advisor in case Kayla wanted to pursue a restraining order. But she did not push. She let Kayla choose. "You don't need to decide everything today. You only need to choose the next step. Just one small step is already a lot." Kayla stayed the entire morning, drank 2 more cups of tea, and told fragments of her life as though she was breathing freely for the first time. In the afternoon, as she left with a Phoenix support member, she turned back and whispered to Emily, "I never thought someone would listen to me without telling me to endure a little more. Thank you." When the door closed behind her, Emily sat quietly for several long moments. In her mind, she saw herself years ago, standing in that same room with fear and doubt, woven into her bones, unsure if hope was something she could still believe in. Nick arrived late to pick her up. He found her sitting at her desk, deep in thought, but with a brightness in her eyes he hadn't seen in a long time. He sat across from her. Was today different? Emily smiled, Not the polite smile she used in crowded rooms, but something deeper, steadier. I helped someone, not with advice, not with a grand plan, but simply by being there. I was there for her when she needed someone to believe her. Nick watched her for a long moment, then nodded. That's what I always knew you would do from the first day you wrote the word Phoenix. And I will continue, Emily said softly, because every woman like Kayla deserves a way out. And if I can be the one holding the light even for a short stretch of the road, I will never step back. Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside that small room in the heart of the city, a quiet, unwavering light had been lit, warm and impossible to extinguish. 2 weeks after Kayla left the safe shelter to begin her new life, Emily received an unexpected call from a major national nonprofit dedicated to supporting women affected by abuse. They invited her to be the keynote speaker at their autumn symposium in New York, centered on the theme, Rebirth from Ruin. She read the invitation 3 times, her heartbeat quickening each time. She had stood before small groups, spoken with advisors, worked with attorneys, and sat with countless survivors. But stepping onto a stage with hundreds of people listening was something entirely different. It would not be Emily sitting across from someone with a cup of warm tea between them. It would be Emily beneath the lights, representing something larger than herself. Rachel was the first to tell her, "I know you can do this." Nick said very little, but he printed the letter, framed it, and set it on her desk as if to remind her this moment was not luck, but something she had earned. A few days later, Emily walked into the grand ballroom of a Manhattan hotel amid the noise of footsteps, projectors, staff testing microphones and lights. She wore a deep blue dress, simple yet elegant, her hair loose and natural, her face lightly made up. When the coordinator signaled 10 minutes left, her hands grew cold. Not because she feared the crowd, but because she knew what she was about to share was not a speech crafted by someone else, but a truth carved from blood, tears, and all the nights she thought she would never stand again. When she stepped onto the stage, the lights blurred everything below, but she did not need to see each face. She only needed to remember the look in Kayla's eyes, in Rachel's, and in her own reflection, the day she could no longer recognize the woman staring back. "I once believed I could never escape a man," Emily began, her voice low but steady. "I thought love meant endurance, meant pleasing, meant staying quiet so I would not be left behind. I was wrong. Love is the freedom to be yourself without being punished for it." She told her story, not in a way that would wound those listening, but in a way that let every person who had lived through something similar know she understood. She had been there. She was not different from them. When she spoke of the night Brandon entered the house with a gun, the room fell utterly silent. But when she said she was still here, not only surviving but helping others survive, people began to nod. She ended by saying that every woman has the right to safety, to choice, to being heard. And if they were not ready to walk yet, then sometimes all it took was someone sitting beside them and saying, "I will wait with you," for hope to begin. When she stepped off stage, she barely heard the applause through the ringing in her ears, but she saw the tears, the embraces in the front rows, and knew she had done what she came to do. That night, Nick video called her at the hotel. He did not ask how she felt. He simply smiled and said, "I knew you would touch people's hearts." Emily leaned against the pillow, golden lamplight soft across her face. "I never thought I was meant to be on a stage. But if what I lived through can make someone feel less alone, then I will keep doing it." Nick answered gently, "That's what an inspiration is. Not because they are perfect, but because they are true. And you, Emily, are exactly that." She smiled, nodding slowly. She no longer felt doubt, only the quiet certainty that she had not merely escaped Brandon. She had surpassed the woman she used to be, to step into the role life was unfolding before her, not through heroism, but through a heart once broken that never stopped beating. During the first winter after the New York Symposium, Nick brought her to his family home in the northern Illinois suburbs for their annual Christmas gathering. The house stood in a peaceful neighborhood, always warmed by a glowing fireplace and a Christmas tree decorated since early December. Before stepping inside, Emily paused for a moment at the wooden door, her hand tightening around Nick's. Not because she feared judgment, but because the last time she entered a home beside a man she loved, she had not been allowed to be herself. Nick looked at her with a quiet promise in his eyes, assuring her this time would be different. When the door opened, his mother, Ellen, enveloped her in an embrace like family long overdue. "Oh, finally," she said. "I have heard about you for so long, and no, not in a bragging way, but the way someone speaks of what they cherish and want to protect." "I am not used to mothers like her," Emily whispered later while helping Nick's father, William, set the table. "She makes me feel like I do not have to prove anything, just that I am welcome." "Because you are yourself," Nick said, taking her hand, "and because they see what I see." That evening, after dinner, everyone sat around the fireplace sharing old stories, remembering past winters with laughter echoing through the house. Emily learned Nick had once played the piano, skipped math class to play baseball, and wrote weekly letters home when he studied away. No one asked about Brandon, or her past, or pushed with insensitive curiosity. Instead, Ellen told stories of the women in their family who survived war, illness, miscarriages, and silent losses. Only resilience could carry them through. When it was Emily's turn, she spoke of Phoenix Foundation, of Kayla, of the early days when it was just her, a worn desk, and a dream without shape. They listened, not because the story was grand, but because she told it with humility and depth. They saw not a heroine, but someone ordinary who refused to give up. The next morning, Ellen placed a small box in Emily's hands. Inside was an old leather journal. "My mother used this to write down the things that told her she was living right," she said. "Today, I want you to continue the pages." Emily was taken aback, tears rising as she hugged her. "You have come so far to reach this place," Ellen whispered, "and you deserve to keep going from a foundation that will hold you." Returning to Chicago, Emily carried more than a journal. She carried the sense that she had found a piece of family she once thought she would forever lack. In the new apartment she and Nick moved into at the start of the year, every morning felt like a beginning. They woke early, made coffee, read, shared news, without needing many words. On weekends, they went to Phoenix together to support new cases. Sometimes they simply sat quietly in her office, sunlight falling on Nick's shoulders as he reviewed financial reports, while Emily wrote in Ellen's journal, capturing the small but meaningful moments of the day. One day she wrote, "Today Kayla called just to say she is dating someone new and no longer dreams of him." On another page she wrote, "I helped a 12-year-old girl write her first letter to her mother in the shelter. I just sat beside her, doing nothing, but I was there." Nick read those lines and said, "You are not just someone who survived. You are someone rebuilding the places no one else dares to walk into." Emily's new life was not dazzling or grand, but it was steady, like a home built by hands that once trembled but never let go. Nick's family had become her second home, not because they needed a perfect daughter-in-law, but because they wanted to help her write the next chapters filled with laughter, tears, and hope. And Nick, the man who never promised to shield her from darkness but chose to walk beside her through every uneven step, was now an inseparable part of the journey she lived each day with gratitude and quiet courage. At a special year-end ceremony hosted by the Phoenix Foundation, Emily stepped up to the podium as warm golden lights washed over the hall. Below her were familiar faces who had walked beside her through every difficult mile of her journey. Rachel, Kayla, Ellen, and the women who were now rewriting their lives day by day. Nick was there too, seated in the front row, watching her with the same quiet steadiness he had offered from the very beginning. Emily stood tall, holding the microphone without trembling, and her voice carried clearly, rich with emotion. "If someone had told me 4 years ago that I would be standing here today, I would not have believed them. Back then, I thought my life belonged to someone else, that fear was the only place I was allowed to live. But I was wrong, because I did not simply escape a man. I surpassed the person I used to be. I learned that a wound does not need to disappear for you to live a joyful life. It only needs to be seen, acknowledged, and loved. I once believed I was weak because I endured for so long. Now I know that was where my strength was born." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the silent room. "Over these past years, I have witnessed miracles inside small, ordinary rooms. A woman daring to say no for the first time. A child telling her mother that she did not want to go home that day. A legal advocate saying, 'I believe you.' All of these moments, seemingly small, were in truth the beginning of entirely new lives. The Phoenix Foundation is no longer just a modest office with a few aging desks. We are expanding into 3 new branches across major cities, preparing to train a new generation of specialists, and building a support network that will reach across the country. But what makes me proudest is not the numbers or the development plans. It is every time we hear someone say, "I feel like I matter," because that means we are succeeding in reminding each other that every person deserves to live in freedom, in safety, in love without conditions. I want to end this speech with a question for everyone listening. If you have ever been hurt, ever felt unworthy, ever believed no one could understand you, then ask yourself this. If today were the day you allowed yourself to begin again, what is the very first thing you would do? I hope that answer leads you to where you truly belong. And if you have already found that place, please do not forget to be the light for someone else. After a wave of applause rolled through the hall, Emily stepped down from the podium with a lightness and completeness she had never felt before. She had said what needed to be said, not to be pitied, not to be praised, but so people would know there is a way out, and that anyone can find it. Emily's story ends here, but the journey of spreading hope will continue. And if you have stayed with us until the very end of this story, we thank you with all our hearts. Did this story touch you? Did it remind you of someone in your life, or perhaps of yourself, someone who once felt lost and needed a hand to hold? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We truly hope to read every sincere word you leave, because every response is a thread of connection, a reminder that kindness still exists. And do not forget to subscribe, like, and share this video if you found meaning in it. We will continue bringing heartfelt, inspiring stories every day. Thank you for being here, for listening, for empathizing, and for believing that everyone deserves a chance to begin again. Wishing you good health, peaceful days, and the courage to always live as your true self. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.